Welcome back to Why Wait Till Sunday, the college football DFS show. I'm your host, Alfred, and we coming off a tough week last week, and we're going to get right back into it in week 11. So we've got a full DK slate on Saturday that looks like this. TCU at West Virginia, Miami at Va Tech, Indiana at Michigan State, Penn State at Nebraska, a non-Power 5 game, Middle Tennessee at Marshall, which is interesting. Wake Forest at North Carolina, USC at Arizona, Louisville at Virginia, Notre Dame at Boston College. Let's see, that's postponed. Baylor at Texas Tech, postponed, and postponed. So there's 4 games that are no longer active, which limits our player pool. But we're still going to have 10 games to choose from. So that's a mighty fine slate there for us. Highest total game on the slate is unfortunately postponed. That's Ohio State and Maryland. The next highest is going to be Virginia Tech, Miami, and UNC Wake Forest, both at 66.5. And also Louisville, Virginia is 66.5. So we've got 3 games at 66.5 total over under. Then it drops pretty substantially down to a couple games between 57 and 55, and then a 51, which is Indiana and Michigan State. We have a 48 total, Notre Dame, Boston College, and then a 45 total, TCU, West Virginia. We do not have a line on USC and Arizona just yet. The largest team total on the slate, now that Ohio State is postponed, is going to be a tie between UNC and Marshall. Both picked approximately to score 40 points. We have then Va Tech and UVA, so both Virginia schools are looking to score about 35 points. So that's 5 touchdowns or more for those teams. Then we've got a series of teams that are scheduled to score about 4 touchdowns each. That's Miami, Louisville, Notre Dame, Texas Tech, Indiana, Penn State, and Baylor. After that, we drop to under 28 points. Bringing up the rear is Boston College and Middle Tennessee, not even predicted to score by Vegas at least 20 points on the week. So maybe staying away from those teams would be smart. So let's get right into the players. I always want to go over the expensive players at each position. Why are they that expensive, and talk through those guys. And then also we'll drop down and kind of start weeding out a little bit once we get to more of those value plays. So number one, most expensive quarterback on the slate is shockingly Hendon Hooker, who's the quarterback for Virginia Tech. This guy is really having a nice season, but he's essentially a running back. I mean, he hasn't even attempted 20 passes except for one game. He's averaging a roughly 15 attempts per game, but he's carrying the ball almost 20 times a game. He's getting a ton of touchdowns, 2 different games with 3 touchdowns on the ground, which is certainly carrying his fantasy potential. I don't think he's, a very good bet to get a 300-yard bonus through the air or a 100-yard bonus on the ground. And that's kind of a problem when you're paying the most expensive for a quarterback. I mean, he certainly has 2 games, one where he went for 34 points and one against Boston College where he went for 45 points. So he does have a ceiling. I just don't feel comfortable betting on that ceiling when the guy's definitely not going to get a bonus. Extremely touchdown dependent to hit his ceiling. I mean, he's got a nice floor, of course, because the running, but I feel like I can find that in other players that aren't going to cost $9,700. Va Tech loves to run the ball. They've got good duo of running backs. We'll talk about one of them, but they're just not throwing the ball hardly at all. And he obviously has the ceiling. I mean, he has a 45-point game on his resume this year, but I'm not comfortable paying that number for Va Tech, even though their price or their game is scheduled to be quite a shootout. And Va Tech is predicted to be about 35 points. Miami's defense is I mean, I would say they're kind of middle. You know, they're definitely not a defense that, by the numbers, you can take extreme advantage of. They're pretty good, efficient through the air, limiting opponents to only 6.6 passing yards per attempt, and they're kind of middle of the road in terms of volume of rushing attempts and yards per attempt on the ground. So, you know, it's not a complete smash either, even going against the defense. I'm a little out on Hendon Hooker this week. I think there's some better options. Then you have his opponent across the sideline there, Derek King, who is playing for Miami now after transferring from Houston. He has not hit 30 points in a game this season, except for the Thursday night bonanza where he went for 54 points last week, 5 touchdowns through the air. I think he ran one in as well. I mean, he went absolutely ham. He didn't run a touchdown in, but he had 100 yards on the ground. Also, his first time getting to 100 on the ground. It was just a perfect spot. Absolute peak performance. Like I said, has not even gotten to 30 points outside of that night. Vatek is not an imposing defense, but, you know, again, I don't want to pay for his career game last week, going into this week. And Miami, so Vatek, you know, kind of a middling defense also. They're giving up some volume. They're not great. They're by no means great, but they're also not a total smash either. So this game does have a high total. I just think I'd rather play some other guys from this game rather than the quarterbacks, who seem to be pretty overpriced. Next, that we come down to my guy again. I think I'm going to ride into battle again with him, is Keaton Slovis. He's 8,600, and it's up from last week. He was 7,800 last week, so he's up to 8,600. It's quite an increase. I mean, it's $800, even though he didn't have an incredibly good game. The matchup against Arizona should be pretty sweet. We don't have data on them this year, but last year they were pretty generous, giving up 8 yards through the air per attempt and a pretty sizable volume, both in terms of run volume and pass attempt volume per game. This was a team that really allowed a lot of plays to be run against them. We know USC wants to run fast. I mean, they threw the ball almost 60 times last week, and they're running basically a very wide open, fast paced passing game. I think Keaton Slovis is a sneaky guy to, you know, routinely turn in 350 and 4 touchdowns. They're kind of running a bit of an air raid, which, you know, quarterbacks that do that in college, well, I think he's good anyway, but quarterbacks who do that in college, I mean, they can put up just insane numbers. I mean, the entire offense is probably going to run through him. Don't have much of a running game. Last week was a bit odd. They had, you know, 2 rushes, and then also lost possession deep inside the opponent's territory a couple of times. So he only had 2 touchdowns through the air. I think it could have been much better. I like him again, even at 8,600 against Arizona. Definitely not scared of that defense. And it's a bit of a premium. I'm disappointed to see it that high, but that doesn't make me completely shy away from Slovis. Next, we have Mikhail Cunningham for Louisville. He's 8,100. I have generally liked to play non-Cunningham lineups when I play Louisville. He's a good player, especially for college. He doesn't run, so he's priced like a guy who I think is going to run a lot and get 60 to 70 to 80 plus yards on the ground and a couple of rushing touchdowns. And that's just not his game. I mean, he's typically running for 20 to 40 yards, but he's not a featured runner the way that some of these quarterbacks would be, you know, with 18, 20 attempts per game. And he doesn't routinely throw for 300 yards. He did in his last game and the first 2, but between there, he's got 107, 229, 132, and 278. This is a pretty decent matchup against Virginia to get going through the air. They give up 9.9 yards per attempt and a decent amount of passing volume, but they do not give up a ton on the ground in terms of yards per attempt at only 3.3. They give up 39 rushes per game, which is kind of a lot. So pretty decent volume play in terms of teams that play them seem to run a lot of plays. But I just think, yeah, 8,100s. I'm just a little out on 8,100 for Cunningham. We'll talk about some of his weapons, but I don't think that's great because right under him you have Sam Howell for 8,000, which kind of makes no sense. Weird pricing decision, in my opinion, for DraftKings. I mean, the guy is coming off 33 and 29, and he's priced at only 8,000. So he's priced to easily go about 3.5x. He had a decent game last week. I guess I don't know why they chose to do that. I mean, Javonte Williams, who we'll talk about, is going absolutely bonkers and scoring, multiple touchdowns per game. Maybe they just think that UNC wants to run the ball, but Sam Howell is still very, very good. And Wake Forest shapes up to be a really nice matchup. They've got the second highest team total on the slate. Wake Forest gives up a really nice pass volume, 35 attempts per game so far in 6 games, which is the third or the fifth highest pass attempts of any team on the slate that, defense allowed. Wake Forest run D is certainly not good, but it's also not absolutely horrible. I think the UNC is probably going to have their way with them. Obviously, they're tied for the most points now on the slate. I think I said second most before, but I forgot OSU is gone. So certainly an offense you want to invest in, and their quarterback, who we know is a good player, is priced just so low. Howell is 8th most expensive at only $8,000. I just really like that value. I have no problem going with Howell. I mean, especially if you're playing in a tournament, and I think he's a fine cash game play too, but coming off a game, everybody's high on these running backs that UNC has. Javonte Williams has gone back-to-back games with, I think, 3 touchdowns or 2 out of the last 3 games, something like that. So he'll be highly rostered, and Howell may be a little overlooked. But you want to keep playing him, honestly, because you want to catch that week where he throws 5 touchdowns. And I think that's certainly in play. Might as well be Wake Forest. I don't see why not. Wake Forest's offense should be able to put up some points. It's not a terrible offense, and UNC's defense is not very good. I mean, I actually like UNC stacks because these games are trending towards pinball games. Then we have Michael Penix. He's 7,200. Michigan State has allowed the 3rd most pass attempts per game, although on a rate basis, they're a little bit stingy, only 5.8 yards per attempt. They're also allowing pretty good amount of rush attempts on the ground, and Penix can run a little bit. I mean, he's done, he'll have 6 rushing attempts, 5 rushing attempts, maybe get you 20 yards. So certainly not a big threat on the ground, but he can get in the end zone. He's got a couple rushing touchdowns already this season. But he's attempted 36, 26, and 50 attempts in the last 2 games. They're certainly happy to let him toss it around. He had 342 yards and 3 touchdowns. He had 3 touchdowns the week before. So sitting at 7,200, he's put up 29 points in two weeks in a row. This matchup is not very concerning to me. Michigan State is kind of getting run all over. It is at Michigan State, but they seem to be not a very good defense. I think it's a nice value. 7,200. I mean, I have no problem playing Penix and some of his weapons, and we'll get to that offense. I think that offense seems a little depressed on price. We come to Asher O'Hara. You might not recognize that name. He is the quarterback for Middle Tennessee. The reason I like him, he's got over 20 rush attempts in the last 3 games. So he is absolutely the entire offense. He runs the ball a ton. He obviously is the quarterback, so he's going to throw some. He does have 2 games over 300 yards through the air, in addition to all these rushing attempts. The big problem is Middle Tennessee has a team total of only 17. Yes, he will probably get both touchdowns if they get to 17 points. Maybe they go over their team total and he gets 3 touchdowns. At 6,600, though, I'd like to see that down at 6,000, maybe even less. At 6,600, he feels more like a floor play than a true ceiling play. I don't think he's going to get 4+ touchdowns on his own against that pretty stout Marshall defense that they will be playing against. Next, we come to Brennan Armstrong. He's 6,500 for Virginia. I like this guy. Again, we want that Konami code when we can get it. He's got 15 to 20 rushes in him probably. His team has shockingly, Virginia has the 4th highest team total on the slate. That's something that I don't think a lot of people are going to consider, but it is true. They are sitting at 35 against Louisville, who has a pretty bad defense in general, especially on the ground, and Armstrong is going to run the ball. He's got 3 out of the last 5 games over 27 points. He's only 6,500. That seems like there's a pretty good chance he's going to go 4x or more in a game that I think is going to shoot out, and so does Vegas. I really like that number at 6,500. Again, getting that rushing upside, getting the possible for a rushing touchdown is really where you can see these guys go for 30+ points at their price point. When we have even more savings, 2 more guys we're going to talk about. Charlie Brewer at only 6,200 is the Baylor QB, and he is going against Texas Tech's horrible defense. He's averaging about 38 attempts since week 1 when he only threw like 20-something times. He's also going to run the ball 10 to 12 times. He does not have a rushing touchdown in the season yet, but he'll chip in 20 to 30 rushing yards. Certainly not like some of these other guys we're talking about, also not a zero. And, the matchup is just really, really nice. I mean, if he's going to throw 38 times against Texas Tech at 6,200, sign me up. I think 3 touchdowns are certainly in play for this guy, and he will allow us to play a lot of these other expensive receivers that we're going to want to cram in our lineups. And finally, you've got an awesome name, Rocky Lombardi. I had not heard much about this guy until I started researching this slate. He is Michigan State's quarterback. He comes in at only 6,000. In his first 2 games of the season, this is a first-time starter. He threw for 300 yards, getting that bonus. Then he kind of tanked. The whole team tanked when they went and played at Iowa, as can be expected. At Iowa is a difficult place to play. Iowa's defense is always a difficult defense to play against. But now they come in and they get Indiana's defense, which is a lot more generous than the previous one that they played. I wouldn't say Indiana is a complete pushover, but they are allowing pretty decent amount of passing attempts, middle of the road yards per attempt allowed, and really just kind of not imposing. But at this, you're talking about a price point of 6,000. I mean, this guy does not have to get to 30 points even, although that's probably in his range of outcomes if he gets to 300 yards. Indiana does set up to be a team you're going to want to try to pass on more than you're going to want to run on. So they've got that in his, he's got that in his back pocket there. In terms of game strategy, might be in his favor. They're probably going to be trailing. I mean, I don't think it's going to necessarily be a blowout. They are 7.5-point dog. So that's kind of a nice number. That means they're not going to be just blown out completely, but also they're going to need to play aggressive and outscore their opponent. They probably won't be able to just coast. I like Rocky Lombardi just for the name alone. And also he's an interesting play at 6,000. So you've got good quarterbacks all up and down the slate. I like Slovis at a little more expensive. I like Howell at 8,000. And then Penix, Armstrong, Brewer, Lombardi, all those guys can mix and match and fit them into whatever your lineup needs to look like. You've got plenty of choices at all the different price points this week at quarterback. Now we move on to running back. We've got Javonte Williams. He's 9,500. I've already beat him to death in terms of just talking about how good he's been, but this guy is just a touchdown machine. I said last week I'm going to have to stop fading him, but I think I'm going to keep fading him at 9,500. I mean, he's not going to get 3 touchdowns every week, right? Famous last words. I just this offense is really good, and they do have a quarterback they can lean on. They have playmakers at wide receiver. Um, I think there's going to be there. He's already had a dud week. I mean, where he put up only like 12 points. So that is certainly in the range of outcomes for Javonte Williams. I think as his price just keeps going up, I'm okay fading him and then just crossing my fingers and hoping he doesn't go for 3 touchdowns again. But I think if I'm going to play UNC, it's not going to be Williams at that price point. Kyren Williams, the running back for Notre Dame, I played him 2 weeks ago against Georgia Tech. They only gave him 15 carries, and he got in the end zone twice, but kind of disappointed. Then last week, he went bonkers against Clemson, 23 carries, 140 yards, and 3 touchdowns, which kind of had me tilting because that should have been his line against Georgia Tech. I faded him against a good Clemson defense, and look what happened. Now he's going to go up against Boston College this week, which is just not a very favorable environment. It is at Boston College, which is just a tough place to play. Now, Notre Dame is favored, but Boston College is only allowing 34 rush attempts as a defense per week. That is near the bottom of any of the teams on this slate. They're allowing 4.2 yards per carry, which is kind of on the low end. It's just, the way Boston College plays historically and this year too, it's just like not a fast pace flying around defense. I don't want a running back in that matchup. I mean, I think that game might favor a little bit more of like an NFL back and forth, but that's not what we want for college DFS. We want those crazy games that have a chance to go like 72-70. So I think I'm out on Kyren Williams, although I like him as a player. I'm out this week at that price point in that matchup. Then we have Khalil Herbert. He's 8,700 for Virginia Tech. Certainly don't mind him. Not routinely getting 20 carries, but certainly playing very, very well, averaging a heck of a lot of yards per carry, actually approaching about 10, but he's not used a ton in the passing game just because Va-Tech doesn't pass very much. It's a game with a high team total and a high overall total, which you would like to play. He is potentially dinged up. He listed as questionable. I guess he injured his hammy last week. I think I'd stay away from that at 8,700. You can keep an eye on it if he's definitely going to play on Saturday morning. I don't have a problem with it, but he's basically a split backfield between him and Hooker. Now that Hooker is back and playing well, and Hooker seems to be kind of more like the goal line back. I mean, if they get real close, he seems to punch it in more than Herbert. So I don't love that price point. He certainly could go for 3 touchdowns. I mean, any of these guys could, but we got to play within the most likely scenario and then look at other values and say, is this guy who's less have a similar chance of doing something like that? And I think we can do better. So I don't like any of the top 3 running backs on the slate this week. Then we come to Brendan Knox. He is 8,500. He is Marshall's absolute workhorse running back. He is almost for sure going to get 25 plus carries. He's not used a ton in the passing game, maybe 1 reception, but that is not going to be something that you want to bank on for him. But he is like absolutely their offense. 25 plus carries is definitely in play. Middle Tennessee is yielding the most yards per game on the ground on this slate. I don't know what else the matchup is absolutely perfect. Now, the narrative you could tell yourself is MTSU knows they're bad at the run. They completely sell out to stop Knox, who's clearly the best player on Marshall's team. And maybe you tell yourself a story that says they're going to figure out a way to stop the one-dimensional Marshall attack. But that is also something that, as you watch the 3 touchdown game come from Knox on Saturday, you're like, why did I do that? That was so dumb. It was obviously a smash spot. And that's a little bit where I'm leaning. I mean, he's the 4th or 5th most expensive running back on the slate at 8,500. So you're paying a premium, but not a super premium. I mean, he's $1,000 less than Javonte Williams. If he's my, basically value to production to volume kind of running back 1 this week, I would like to say he'd be under-owned because he plays for Marshall, but I think people playing the college football slates are pretty familiar. And if nothing else, you see Marshall versus Middle Tennessee and you go, huh, who's on that team? And a quick search tells you that Knox is a good player. So I don't think he'll be, super unowned, but yeah, I like it. I mean, people are not going to be able to fit Javonte Williams or Kyron Williams and Knox probably. So, he's an interesting guy to play. I'm definitely going to have some Brendan Knox. And I certainly like 25 carries against that defense. And obviously, their number one option near the goal line, et cetera, et cetera. I think 2 touchdowns should probably be expected out of Knox, as much as you can expect 2 touchdowns out of anybody. But 8,500 is a lot for a guy. But these Marshall, Middle Tennessee State, Marshall's predicted to score 40 points. Give me their workhorse running back. I just think that game can get out of hand. Maybe that he gets 30 carries and just goes ham. So I really like that game for Knox. Javian Hawkins is a great player for Louisville. It's kind of a bad matchup on the ground against Virginia, who I think I mentioned before is only giving up 3.3 yards per carry. That's on the very low end of the slate. So I just think it may not be the optimal time to play Hawkins, although he's certainly a workhorse and he's a very good player and he can break a 90-yarder at any given moment. So you like to have that in your running backs. But let's drop down almost $1,000 to 7,200, where we get Stevie Scott for Indiana. Now, we have already talked about Indiana, who has a sneaky good matchup against the Michigan State defense that seems to be giving it up this year. He's only 7,200. I mean, think about that relative to like 8,500 for Knox, 8,300 for Hawkins, and then even more for the other guys. But this guy is averaging 23 touches a game, about 20 to 21 carries. He's getting 2 to 3 receptions pretty consistently. He has 2 touchdowns in 2 of his last 3 games. And Indiana's favored. So that means they should be playing more comfortably from a lead. They should not have to just abandon the run game. This is a guy they're leaning on. I mean, 23 plus touches a game. That's great usage, even compared to Knox, who I said expect 25 carries. Well, Scott's getting at least 23, and some of them are receptions, which is more valuable. For only 7,200, I think he's a really nice value play in a game that you think of Indiana, Michigan State, you're probably thinking, 12-9 final, but not this year, I don't think. I mean, Indiana's better on offense. Michigan State is better. The total is 51.5. Michigan State's only really projected to score 22 points, so that's not so great. But, Indiana is predicted to score 30 points. That's great. And I think we can get some value out of Stevie Scott. I think he's a great target in the middle area of the running back price range for you this week. Cameron Harris, 5,900 for Miami. Man, he started off this season so hot. I know if Boz is watching this, he's your guy, and you were just through the roof excited about him at the start of the season. He's kind of disappeared, although there was a kind of squeaky wheel narrative last week. He got 15 touches and he looked better in that huge back and forth game that they had last week against NC State. But he comes in at a nice price point, 5,900. I think we can expect 15 to 20 touches. He's really a good player, I think, but he's just, the volume kind of hasn't been there. The offense has been a little clunky. But this matchup is a good one. Like I said, this game is tied for the highest total on the slate at 66.5. Vatek is vulnerable on the ground. They're giving up 39 rushing attempts per game and a very solid, well, bad, I guess, solid for us, 5.2 yards per carry. They're kind of middle of the road through the air, so certainly a little more relatively vulnerable on the ground. I think Cameron Harris is definitely sneaky play at 5,900. Most people aren't thinking about those first 2 weeks where he just went crazy, and at this point, he's a little bit of an afterthought. I'd be real happy to play him at 5,900 if you need some savings at running back, and certainly available to make a big run And I like that. I like that price point in a game that, Miami can take advantage of Vatek on the ground. Next, we have, I say with a heavy heart, Devin Ford, who's 5,600. And I kind of sworn him off. I mean, last week he tanked so many of my lineups against Maryland. The whole team got just boat raced from the start. None of it made any sense. Maryland. But he's back in the range here at 5,600 as a running back in a good matchup against Nebraska in a game that Penn State's favored with a decently high total. Nebraska gives up 43 rushing attempts per game. And, it's been only 2 games for the Big Ten slate, but they have been run all over. Only giving up 24 pass attempts per game. So, that's not a lot of volume through the air. It could be a function of who they've played, of course, with only 2 games so far, but teams are hitting the ground against them and having success. Devin Ford may find his way into my lineups again at 5,600 if we need the savings. And I think we will, because there's so many high-end receivers that I want to cram all 4 into my lineup. And finally, speaking of Penn State running backs, we have Keziah Holmes, who's freshman for Penn State. He's the bare minimum 3,000. He had 10 carries last week. I would search through this week if you can get any news bites about Holmes, whether or not he's gained some trust or the coaching staff wants to see a little bit more out of him. Kind of a smaller guy, probably not going to be, a dominant workhorse, but in college you can get away being smaller. I mean, we're not talking about his NFL potential here. We're just talking about, can he explode against a bad Nebraska defense? If I get any information on the internets that Keziah Holmes may have earned himself a little more playing time, I mean, he could be very interesting at $3,000. So keep him in mind. Certainly not a guaranteed lock by any means, but if we get some information about Holmes, I would be interested in him. He got more use than Kayvon Lee, who is another freshman running back for Penn State that only, I think, got 1 carry even in the blowout last week. All right, receivers. Jahan Dotson is 8,800. He is the most expensive wide receiver on the slate yet again, and with good reason. Nebraska doesn't give up a ton of passing attempts. They're bad on yards per attempt, however, and I don't think they're a very good defense. And Scott Frost, is their coach, and he came from UCF, and they didn't have the best defense there either. They play very fast. These games have a tendency to be very offensive-centric, so I'm fine playing him. I'm not sure I love it. Again, if I'm going to pay that super premium where he's the most expensive receiver on the slate, 8,800, I think I want a guy with a better quarterback than Sean Clifford on a team that wants to throw the ball a little bit more than what I think Penn State will want to do. So, yeah, I think I'm probably a little out on Dotson as the most expensive receiver. I really like Dyami Brown yet again at 7,100. He's depressed in his price, down from 7,700 last week because he had a terrible game. But I already said how I like Sam Howell. I like the matchup against Wake Forest. And this guy is awesome. I mean, he is really good. Bo Corrales is still out. And I think I threw out there last week that since Bo Corrales has been out up until last week, he was commanding almost 40% of the yards and receptions. So I don't know what happened last week. It was a bit of a weird game. They did tons of damage on the ground, and Sam Howell threw 2 touchdowns to running backs, in addition to the running backs themselves scoring on the ground. So, bounce back for Dyami Brown? I think so, and I will be playing a decent amount of him at 7,100. Next, we have Mike Harley, who's $6,900. He's like the 4th or 5th most expensive receiver on the slate. He's got 18 receptions in the last 2 games. And I like him because this is a game, like I said, high team total, high game total, should be fairly competitive and back and forth. I do think that the Hurricanes can capitalize on the ground, but it's not like Virginia Tech is too scary through the air. They're a little bit to the point where I didn't want to pay the premium for Derek King, but Mike Harley, if he's going to be their leading receiver and get 6 to 7 to 8 catches, I would be in on him at 6,900. We shall see if he fits into the lineups because I definitely want Brown, and I think I definitely want Amon-Ra St. Brown. He's 6,700 coming off a 100-yard game last week, didn't get into the end zone. Could be overlooked for that reason, but again, I like Slovis. I like this matchup against Arizona, and St. Brown will once again be a guy I target a lot of. His teammate Drake London, who kind of went off in week one, is 5,800. People will probably look at that and say, I'm going to play Drake London for 5,800, which I can't say is a bad idea, but I also think that the alpha is still Amon-Ra St. Brown, and I will be happy to play him, especially if he's a little depressed on his how much he's rostered. And then we got Tutu Atwell, 6,500. Like that a lot. So, like I said, Louisville plays Virginia, who is a little bit stout on the ground, but can give it up through the air. Atwell does not need a ton of catches. He is a long bomb or just a yards after catch. He can turn anything into a 90-yard run. 6,500 feels really good. I'm really interested in Tutu Atwell this week at that price. I think I'd love to run some lineups out there with Dyami Brown, Amon-Ra St. Brown, and Atwell as my 3 receivers. Now, that's a lot of money on receivers, but we can find some value elsewhere, and I think that's going to be a threesome that I really try to do for my lineups this week. We talked about Indiana, and of course, I like their number 1 receiver, Whop Philyor, 11 catches last week. So against this Michigan State, I like Penix, I like Stevie Scott, and I like Philyor yet again. Drake London, we talked about him at 5,800. Tyler Vaughn's at 5,200. Probably not too interested in him. You know, he had a great year last year, but I just didn't love his game. I didn't like how he was used last week. Kind of a short possession type guy, which isn't really going to get you anywhere unless you're catching 12 balls. He'd be the 4th receiver I'd play on USC behind St. Brown, London, and a guy we'll talk at the end, Brew McCoy, based on price and everything else. Then we have R.J. Sneed for Baylor. Now, we talked already about Charlie Brewer. Sneed is their number 1 receiver. When he's healthy and going, I do think he's a bit of a target hog. He's been a little hobbled in a couple of games. There is no designation this week that he's injured. Again, we are targeting the Texas Tech defense, and he is their number 1 receiver for Baylor. He's a good player, and I really like the Brewer-Sneed stack. 6,200 for Brewer, 5,000 for Sneed, and that will open up a lot of other things for you to be able to do. That will be something I do a lot of, the Baylor stack with Brewer and Sneed. Then we got Jakari Roberson. We targeted him a couple weeks back, and he didn't have the greatest game against Va Tech. But, in fact, that was the only week out of the last 3 where he wasn't really, really good. 7 for 126. And then the week we played him was 6 for 46, and then he went 7 for 130 and a touchdown. He is Wake Forest leading receiver. They play UNC. That game's probably going to be a back and forth. If not back and forth, there's going to be comeback mode for Wake Forest. He's only 4,900. I really like that price point for a guy who, 2 out of the last 3 weeks has scored 20-plus points. And this looks like a very good opportunity for him to do that again. Then we have Jaden Reed from Michigan State. He's 4,800. I don't think I'll be playing him, but I wanted to highlight this guy. He's a transfer from Western Michigan. He had a great freshman season for them, transferred to Michigan State, had 11 receptions in his debut, and then 1 reception in the last 2 games. So I don't understand that. I like the matchup, and I like this player. Actually, I'm going to have to do a little digging, so check out on Twitter if I find anything about why he only had 1 reception in the last 2 games after 11 in his debut, after dominating as a freshman and then sitting out his redshirt season. I would need to know why he had those reception issues. Parker Washington for Penn State. Again, we do like this matchup against Nebraska. He's 4,400 up from, I think, 3,900 last week, where he smashed and scored 2 touchdowns. And he's behind Dotson, but he's $4,000 cheaper than Dotson. And I would much rather play him on a team that may not have a ton of volume, but could could see, a touchdown or a long reception. Especially, he looks like he's definitely coming on as an option in that passing game. Daz Newsome is 4,300. Again, UNC is without Bo Corrales. He came through for us last week in a good way. He almost had 1,000 yards last year, or did have 1,000 yards last year as a junior. Some people liked him better than Diami Brown going into this season. So at 4,300, I think I would do him again, especially even a UNC stack with Brown, Newsome, and Howell might be a nice contrarian idea to all the people who are going to play Javonte Williams. Then we have an interesting player out of Middle Tennessee, Yusuf Ali. He's 4,100. There's not as many guys. I mean, the last couple of weeks I've had players right around 4 to 4,200 where I've liked 3, 4, or 5 of them. This week there's not nearly as many. I like some of the guys in the 5 to 6 range. So I do think I'm going to need savings at other places to cram in all the receivers that I really like and not as many value guys. But this guy's real interesting. Ali for Middle Tennessee State. They are a big underdog. He's got a pretty high yards per reception at 14, I believe. And probably can expect 4 to 5 receptions. But if he's averaging 15 per, that, 4 to 5, 60 to 75 yards, maybe, hope he gets in the end zone. That could be 2 to 3X, even without, or it could be, 2 to 3X, even without a touchdown, potentially. If he gets in the end zone, you're looking at, 3.5 to 4X price range in a game. They're going to need to throw probably. He's kind of interesting. I mean, 4,100. I wish, again, these guys would get down into the 35s, but that's not what we're doing. We have to make these decisions. He does have 2 20-point games on his resume this year against Rice and Texas San Antonio. Marshall is going to be a little more difficult. Their defense is just pretty good. But I would say, if anything, teams are throwing on them more than they are running on them. So, you've got that in your favor. If you need the savings, you could do worse. I think he's an interesting little dart throw. He'll be rostered in very few teams, and I think he can be interesting for us at 4,100. And finally, we have Brew McCoy at 4,000. This guy caught a touchdown last week. He's I guess a redshirt freshman. He was a freshman last year. He looks good. He's a big player. They've said he may play kind of that Michael Pittman role. He caught, I think, 4 or 5 passes last week. One of them was a touchdown that kind of saved us off a tipped pass, but he did get in the end zone. At 4,000, again, I like this passing game. He's definitely out on the field pretty frequently. He, is definitely a part of that offense. He's one of their starting group. If they run 4 wide, I think he's certainly in the 4 wide. He's a good athlete, playmaker type guy. So definitely like him at 4,000. You're getting savings there. I'd rather play Brew McCoy at 4 than Tyler Vaughn's at 5,200, just because I think the upside relative to the value is better for McCoy. Although I'll probably be playing mostly St. Brown and some Drake London. And so those are the targets. I think it is an odd slate. We've got this guy Brandon Knox for Marshall, who's kind of a wild card. I mean, is he going to be, how I'm thinking about him, or is going to be incredibly popular, or is he going to be, people are going to gloss over him and just gloss over the entire Marshall Middle Tennessee game? I'm not sure what's going to happen with that. The game definitely sticks out like a sore thumb when you're looking at all these other Power 5 conference and, kind of elite matchups, and you've got Marshall Middle Tennessee State. So it's like, what the heck? That doesn't even belong on here. But I really like him. So he's an interesting guy. He's going to probably dictate winners and losers, whether you fade him or not. I think that's one of the key players this week. Stevie Scott at running back. Knox and Scott is a very interesting pairing at running back. And then, you're going to have to find value elsewhere at quarterback, which there's definitely some there. Receiver, harder to find value. I kind of find myself wanting to pay up for receiver and save at quarterback and maybe middle ground at running back. And there you have it. That is the week 11 slate as I see it. I am Alfred. That is at AL_FF_RED. We're going to keep doing this. Why wait till Sunday? There's plenty of awesome games going on before then. Throw some lineups on Saturday and let's have some success this week. All right. See you guys.